Okay, I'm going to start the lecture now because it's a few minutes after 12:30 and we've only got 50 minutes, okay? So, my name is Ray Brassier from the Philosophy Department, and this is a lecture about Plato's Republic, okay? And everyone, I hope, has a handout, and I'll basically be covering the main points in the handout. So, there are quotations on the handout that I will be pointing out during the course of the lecture, okay? So, I'll start. Plato's Republic is a work devoted to explaining the link between justice and politics or governance. It was written in or around the year 375 BC, when Plato was in his early 50s. Plato's dates, in case you don't know, are 428 BC to 348 BC, so he lived for about 80 years, and he wrote the Republic in his 50s, so it's a work of Plato's maturity. It contains many of the ideas for which he is most famous. Okay, his theory of forms, his distinction between the domains of the sensible and the intelligible, and his claim that a just society would be one in which philosophers ruled. Now, the Republic is classed among Plato's Socratic dialogues, since Socrates is its narrator and central interlocutor. And Socrates, of course, was Plato's teacher. As a young man, as a young Athenian, Plato was one of the disciples of Socrates, one of the many young men who followed the teaching of Socrates. But Socrates himself did not write anything down. He never wrote anything. But he figures as a kind of teacher in lots of the dialogues that Plato wrote. Okay, so not all, but a significant portion of Plato's writings are written in a dialogue form, and Socrates is the crucial figure, the central figure. So the Republic is a Socratic dialogue. We're going to focus on books 6 and 7 of the Republic, especially sections 471c to 521b. And this is part 7 in the Penguin edition, which features a translation by Desmond Lee, which I think is the... You can't hear? Is this not on? Is anyone having difficulty hearing me? Okay, I need to... Is this better? Okay, sorry. So these, I'm going to focus on the most famous parts of the book, where Socrates explains the distinction between the visible and the intelligible in the famous allegory of the cave, which is on the handout. But in order to understand the meaning of this allegory, we must first need to understand the context in which Socrates presents it. So at the heart of the Republic is the question, what is justice? And throughout the first part of the book, Socrates is engaged in arguing against those who insist that justice does not really exist, that there is no such thing. There are those who claim that justice is merely whatever is advantageous to the strong, while there are others who insist that justice is sought not for its own sake, but merely for the sake of personal advantage. And they challenge Socrates to define justice in such a way that it be desirable for itself, rather than because of something separate from it. Now, Socrates does not answer this question about what justice is immediately, but the attempt to answer it will occupy him throughout the remainder of the book. And he begins by pointing out that justice, if it exists, is something that exists both in the individual and in society as a whole, since we talk both of individuals being just and of a society as being just. So Socrates proposes to explain what justice might be at the level of society as a whole in terms of the structure of the individual human mind. And according to him, the mind has 3 parts: appetite, spirit, and wisdom. And these three aspects of the human mind find their analogues in society. Craftsmen and merchants are those who satisfy our needs and desires, so they correspond to appetite in the individual. Auxiliaries, or what Socrates calls auxiliaries, are the warriors who fight for a society, and they correspond to the part of the mind known as spirit. And lastly, what Socrates calls guardians are entrusted with ensuring the harmony of appetite and spirit, or of industry and honor. And they correspond to the part of the mind which is wisdom. Okay, so wisdom is the harmonious concordance of appetite and spirit. And a just society will be one in which the human needs, as satisfied by craftsmen and merchants, are harmonized with human virtues, as represented by the warriors, the auxiliaries. So the next question is, having given a provisional definition of what justice is, we've got to try to understand what makes an answer like this a good one. How do we know that we've secured the definition of justice? That we've succeeded in saying what justice truly is? And to understand this is we have to understand what's involved in giving a definition of anything. What we've done according to Socrates is to grasp the form of justice in giving a definition. Now, the word form is used to translate the Greek word aidos, also translated as idea. Okay? Sometimes some translations have idea instead of form. But Plato never explicitly defines what he means by aidos, but his use of it is fairly consistent, and it's relatively clear to see what he intends. The aidos, or form of a thing, is what that thing is in itself, independently of the beliefs and opinions humans may have about it. So, the form of justice is the unchanging pattern or structure common to all the varieties of things that we describe as just. So before we can hope to bring about a just society, i.e. a society in which justice has been truly realized, we have to have understood what justice truly is. And this is its form. So the form of justice for Socrates, and this is quote number 1, is an ideal pattern we were looking for when we tried to say what justice and injustice are in themselves, and to describe what the perfectly just or unjust man would be like if he ever existed. End quote. So the search for the form or ideal pattern of justice is the task of the philosopher, since the philosopher is he or she who strives to understand the true nature of things. They are the lovers of wisdom, Sophia. So the guardians of the ideal republic must be lovers of wisdom, not lovers of power, according to Socrates. And this leads him to make the proposal he knows will be scorned and ridiculed, which is that the realization of a just society requires that lovers of wisdom become rulers and that rulers become lovers of wisdom, i.e. philosophers. This is quote number 2, okay? The society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself, till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers. And political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands, while the many natures, now content to follow either, i.e. either political power or philosophy, to the exclusion of the other, are debarred from doing so. This is what I have hesitated to say for so long, knowing what a paradox it would sound. For it is not easy to see that there is no other road to real happiness, either for society or the individual. End quote. Now, Socrates is well aware of how ridiculous his proposal sounds. He knows perfectly well that philosophers are generally considered fantasists, unfit to exercise any sort of power. And this is as true now as it was back in Socrates' day. Philosophers are more often than not dismissed as dreamers, secluded in their ivory tower of idle speculation, far removed from everyday reality. They are those who prefer to contemplate unreal abstractions rather than engage with the practical realities of power. But Socrates has a rejoinder to this. He's going to suggest that it is philosophers who understand the true nature of reality, while those who remain ignorant of philosophy are deluded dreamers. And this is precisely what the allegory of the cave will seek to explain. But before we consider it in detail, we have to make a few preliminary clarifications. Socrates introduces the allegory by elaborating on what the love of wisdom entails. To love something, he insists, is to love all of it, to love it as a whole. So those who love wisdom must desire wisdom as a whole and not just the parts of wisdom. Now, what is wisdom as a whole? It is knowing that which is wholly and indivisibly good, or the good as such, the absolutely good. And as Socrates puts it, and this is quote number 3, okay, this is Socrates. Do you think there's any point in possessing anything if it's not good? Is there any point in having all other forms of knowledge without that of the good, and so lacking knowledge about what is good and valuable? End quote. So, Socrates is saying the following. Both wisdom and justice are good, but they are not the good itself. They are parts of the good. To desire wisdom as a whole is to want to understand why knowledge and justice are good, what it is that makes knowledge and justice good. And to achieve wisdom as a whole would be to understand that knowledge and justice are good only insofar as they partake of what Socrates calls the good itself. But just as all good things share in that which is wholly and indivisibly good, or the good as such, so knowledge must share in that which is wholly and indivisibly knowledge, or knowledge as such. So the attempt to answer the question, what is justice, has led Socrates to 2 further questions. First, what is knowledge? And secondly, what is the good? So let's begin with knowledge. Socrates asks Glaucon, his interlocutor, this is quote number 4. Does a man who knows something know something or nothing? He knows something. Something which is or which is not. Something which is. How could he know something that was not? Then we are satisfied that whichever way we look at it, what fully is knowable, and what in no way is entirely unknowable. Quite satisfied. Then, if there's anything whose condition is such that it both is and is not, would it not lie between what absolutely is and what... I can hear you from up here, so please, just leave. Okay. Right, I'll carry on, okay. So, since knowledge is related to what is, and ignorance necessarily to what is not, we shall have to find out whether to what lies between them there corresponds something between ignorance and knowledge, if there is such a thing. Yes, isn't there something we call opinion? Of course. Is it the same faculty as knowledge or something different? It's something different. So, opinion and knowledge must have different correlates corresponding to their difference of faculty. They must. So, knowledge is related to what is and knows what is as it is. End quote. That's the end of the passage. So, what does it mean to describe knowledge and opinion as faculties? Socrates defines a faculty as the power in us and in other things that enables us to perform all the various functions of which we are capable. Knowledge and opinion are distinct faculties insofar as they are distinct powers. One is the power to know, while the other is the power to hold opinions. Knowledge is infallible, but opinion is fallible. So since they are different faculties, they each have different domains. The domain of knowledge is, what exists, while the domain of ignorance is what is not, what does not exist. But the domain of opinion is in between what is and what is not. It's intermediary between these two. And this is the domain of the sensible, of what can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled with the senses. So there are those who perceive a variety of beautiful things, but who cannot perceive what beauty is independently of the variety of beautiful things. Similarly, there are those who perceive a variety of things that they call just, but who cannot perceive what justice itself is, independently of all these various things that they call just. Now, the variety they perceive is something. It's not nothing at all, but it's not what truly exists. Whatever can be perceived through the senses is in between being and non-being, or nothingness. It is subject to change, and this is the domain of opinion. This is a proper domain of opinion. So, while knowledge grasps what is fixed and unchanging, opinion pertains to whatever is mutable and transient. So, this is why opinion, for Socrates, can never take hold of what truly is. So, this is quote number 5 now. Okay, Socrates says, "Those then who have eyes for the multiplicity of beautiful things and just acts and so on, but who are unable even with another to guide them to see beauty itself and justice itself, may be said in all cases to have opinions, but cannot be said to know any of the things they have opinions about." End quote. So, it's this distinction between knowledge and opinion that leads Socrates to say that beauty itself and justice itself, i.e. what beauty is, or what justice truly is, can only be seen with the eyes of the mind and not with the eyes of the body. They can only be perceived through the faculty of intelligence. By way of contrast, the eyes of the body, exercising the faculty of sight, are only able to perceive things that are temporarily beautiful, or things that are temporarily just, and not that which is eternally beautiful or eternally just. So, knowledge is a function of the faculty of intelligence, while opinion is a function of the faculty of sight, of the sensible. So, now that we've distinguished knowledge from opinion and the faculty of intelligence from the faculty of vision, we can turn to our second question. What is good? And this is quote number 6. So Socrates says, "The highest form of knowledge is knowledge of the form of the good, from which things that are just and so derive their usefulness and value. If we are ignorant of it, the rest of our knowledge, however perfect, can be of no benefit to us, just as it's no use possessing anything if you can't get any good out of it." End quote. So, Socrates' reasoning can be summarized as follows. Justice and wisdom are good. What makes them good is their participation or sharing in the good itself. But it makes no sense to ask what the good itself is good for. It is unconditionally good. It's not good for anything else. It's an end in itself. And once we know the good itself, we don't need to justify it in terms of anything else. In order to clarify this, Socrates proposes an analogy. Just as what we see with the eyes of our body is called visible, So, what we see with the eyes of our minds can be called the intelligible. The good is to knowledge in the domain of the intelligible what the sun is to vision in the domain of the visible. Now, Socrates continues. He says, the sun is not itself sight, it is the cause of sight, and is seen by the sight it causes. So the sun is the source of light that allows us to see whatever is visible. It coordinates the power of vision and the visible. But the good bears the same relation to the faculty of intelligence and intelligible objects within the intelligible realm as the sun does to the faculty of vision and visible objects in the visible realm. So, just as the sun is the ultimate source of light that allows us to see, so the good is the ultimate source of understanding that allows us to know. So as the sun is to vision, so the good is to knowledge. And this is now quote number 7 on the handout. Socrates says, what gives the objects of knowledge their truth and the knower's mind the power of knowing is the form of the good. It is the cause of knowledge and truth, and you will be right to think of it as being itself known, and yet as being something other than, and even more splendid than, knowledge and truth, splendid as they are. And just as it was right to think of light and sight as being like the sun, but wrong to think of them as being the sun itself, so here again it's right to think of knowledge and truth as being like the good, but wrong to think of either of them as being the good, whose position must be ranked still higher. So, the following quote, quote number 8, is a quote where Socrates defines the good as something which he says is higher than any other form. It's higher than knowledge and wisdom, just as the sun, because it's the condition of things participating in knowledge or wisdom. This is why he says in number 8, the good therefore may be said to be the source not only of the intelligibility of the objects of knowledge, but also of their being and reality. Yet it is not itself that reality, but is beyond it and superior to it in dignity and power. Now, the rest of the section we're going to discuss is the parable of the cave. And the parable of the cave is simply trying to explain this analogy between the sun in the visible realm and the good in the intelligible realm. Okay, so that's what the parable is designed to explain. But before we get to the cave, we have to understand the divided line. Socrates extends this analogy, the analogy of the sun and the good, with the example of the divided line. And this is number 9 on the handout. Suppose you have a line divided into 2 unequal parts, and then divide the 2 parts again in the same ratio to represent the visible and intelligible orders. So you've got this line, AE. The segment AC corresponds to the visible domain, and the segment CE corresponds to the intelligible domain. But each segment, both AC and CE, are subdivided. AC is subdivided into AB and BC, and CE is subdivided into CD and DE. Okay? Now these 4 segments of the line represent the different stages of knowledge, according to Plato. Okay? In the visible realm, AC, we can distinguish a lower and a higher degree of knowledge. The lowest level, which is AB, corresponds to the domain of perceptual illusion, when we perceive the shadows or reflections of physical objects rather than the objects themselves. So by illusory objects, Socrates means things like reflections in water, in mirrors, optical illusions, etc. The next level, in the visible, BC, corresponds to the realm of physical objects. These are the original objects of which the shadows and reflections are copies. They are the causes for these reflections or these illusions. Okay? Just as shadows are the correlates of illusion, so physical objects are the correlates of belief. So, illusions, the objects of illusions are things like, reflections, shadows. The objects of belief are physical objects, physical things. So shadows are what we see when we see an illusion, and objects are what we see when we believe something, when we have a belief. But there is a higher stage of knowledge which moves beyond the level of physical objects. Okay? And this is now CD, the next stage. Now we move beyond the visible into the intelligible domain, but this is still the lower level of the intelligible realm. And this, for Plato, corresponds to mathematical reasoning, CD. Mathematical reasoning, which for Plato is exemplified by geometry, is superior to belief in physical objects because it understands these visible objects as the images or shadows of pure, abstract mathematical forms. And these mathematical forms allow us to attain a deeper understanding of perceptible objects. Through them, we grasp the geometrical or arithmetical structures incarnated in the measurable properties of physical objects. This claim is underwritten by contemporary physics. I mean, most contemporary physics is Platonic to the degree that it claims that underlying the realm of sensible experience, the world that we perceive through our five senses, is this invisible or microphysical realm of mathematical structures. Okay, so which is why Plato is a great inspiration for contemporary physicists. But mathematical reasoning for Plato is limited because it continues to rely on assumptions that are taken to be self-evident. For instance, the assumption that there are three dimensions of space. There are three-dimensional solids, two-dimensional planes, one-dimensional lines, and zero-dimensional points. Okay? The basic assumptions that underlie Euclidean geometry. These axioms are taken to be intuitively obvious and hence as requiring no justification. But the history of mathematics has shown that such assumptions are not absolutely or universally true. So, while mathematical reasoning is superior to ordinary perceptual belief, which is in turn superior to illusion, it's not the highest stage of knowledge because it's still partly dependent on the properties of space for geometrical reasoning, or properties of time for the relations of succession involved in counting, i.e. first, second, third. So, this is why for Plato the highest level, there's a level beyond the domain of mathematical reasoning. And this is the domain of what he calls intelligence. This is DE, the final and highest stage of knowing. Intelligence treats mathematical assumptions as starting points and steps in the ascension to something which involves no assumption and is the first principle of everything. And this is what Plato calls dialectic. Dialectical reasoning starts from things like mathematical assumptions, but shows that they are not principles in the strict sense, because they depend on something else, right? On spatial or temporal properties, which we do perceive through our senses. So, dialectic ascends from assumption to principle, and then descends from principle to consequence, showing that the consequence is justified because it is grounded in a rational principle that's been uncovered by reason and reason alone. Okay, so now we've got the four levels of the divided line. We need to understand how these four stages are represented in the allegory of the cave. Okay, so there's a diagram on the handout which represents this allegory. Okay, So the allegory is as follows. So you have at the bottom of the cave, which is the lowest level of the diagram, there are prisoners, okay, chained by the neck so that they are facing a wall at the very bottom of the cave, okay? The prisoners can only look straight ahead. They can't turn around because they're chained by the neck. Now, behind them and above them, there's a wall, okay? And there's a little brick wall. Behind this brick wall, further still behind the brick wall, there's a fire in the cave, okay? In between the fire and the wall, both of which are behind the prisoners, people are moving little physical objects, or rather copies of physical objects. For instance, little models of animals, models of trees, etc. Okay, so these objects are being moved, carried to and fro behind the prisoners, and the shadows cast by these replicas are what the prisoners see on the cave wall. Okay? So you've got outside the cave, okay, you've got the realm of, the daylight realm, the realm of, you've got a lake, a tree, and the sun. Okay? So the left-hand column in the diagram represents the stages of the visible realm, okay? So if you go from the bottom to the top of the left-hand column, you've got the bottom, you have the shadows of artificial things. This is what the prisoners see in the cave, okay? They see shadows, but these are shadows not of real things, but of artificial things, because they are shadows cast by little replicas or copies of animals or of other physical objects. Okay? The next level up is the level of artificial things. Okay? The things that are casting the shadows in the cave. And finally, above this level of artificial things, you have the fire. Okay? The fire, which is the only source of light in the cave. Okay? Outside, then, if we move up, we move outside the cave. Outside the cave, okay, we have the reflection of a tree in a lake. This is the shadow of a natural thing. Okay? And then we have the tree itself, which is a natural thing. And then ultimately we have the sun. The sun, obviously, which illuminates the tree and casts the reflection of the tree in the lake. Okay? So the claim is this, is that the fire in the cave, everything in the cave is an imitation or a copy of something outside the cave. Okay? The fire in the cave is an imitation or a copy of the sun outside the cave. The shadows of artificial things in the cave are imitations of the shadows of natural things outside the cave. Artificial things inside the cave are imitations of natural things outside the cave. And the fire is an imitation of the sun. Okay? If you now look at the right-hand column, this gives you the levels that correspond to these objects in the domain of knowledge. Okay, so the lowest level of knowledge, which corresponds to shadows of artificial things, is symbols. Okay, but symbols represent something. Symbols represent living or dead things. And by symbols, Socrates means words or pictures. Okay, they stand for something, and they stand for something that's living or dead. Okay. Living and dead things are illuminated in a way, or are visible because of the physical sun. Okay, so what makes this, the sun in the visible realm corresponds to the fire inside the cave. So what Plato is saying, in fact, is that the entirety of the visible realm is like the cave. He's saying that all the information you have about the world from your five senses makes you a prisoner of opinion, okay? Everything, all the knowledge that you derive in terms of sensation or visibility is simply akin to the knowledge that's available to someone who is trapped inside the cave, okay? So beyond the sun, beyond the visible sun, are things that are not visible, things like mathematical objects, okay? And mathematical objects in this allegory are the shadows, are like the shadows of natural things. And what are these, what are mathematical objects the shadows of? They are shadows of ideas or forms. And the forms are the things which are ultimately real for Plato. So they correspond to the natural things in the visible realm. But beyond the forms is the good, what Plato calls the idea of the good. So that the idea of the good is the source for the intelligibility of forms in the same way in which the sun is the source for the visibility of natural things. Okay? So that's how the allegory operates. Okay? Now, finally, so what Plato proposes is that having explained these kind of these gradations of knowledge, he's saying that those who rely on their senses in order to understand the world are like prisoners in the cave. And they are prisoners of opinion. In other words, everything that they perceive is not something which truly is, it's something which is intermediary between being and non-being. Okay? Everything that we perceive, it's like the flickering shadow on the cave wall. Something which is always turning into something else, and it has no real substance. Okay? So once one understands that sensible perception is not a reliable guide to knowledge, then one understands that, to know something is, first of all, to move from belief in perceptible things to grasping, the mathematical form of something. That's the lowest level of the intelligible. Already mathematics is a step beyond opinion and beyond the beliefs about physical objects, which are simply correlates of opinion. But mathematical knowledge remains incomplete because it has to take certain things for granted which can't be grounded in something more fundamental. Okay. So Socrates now proposes a parable about the nature of education. He's saying that the philosopher is akin to someone who has escaped, who's managed to free himself from the cave and ascend, first of all, see what is causing the shadows in the cave, see the fire in the cave, and then once outside the cave, can understand how everything inside the cave was simply a lower order copy of something outside the cave. So education consists in ascending from the lowest level of knowledge to the highest level, knowledge of the good. And that's the task. And that's the responsibility entrusted to the rulers of a just state. What are the consequences of this for the establishment of such a state? The allegory of the cave is a parable about the nature of intellectual and political responsibility. The goals of education and government are intimately linked. The rulers of the ideal republic must be those who have ascended outside the cave and grasped the form of the good with their mind's eye. But also those who, having seen the good, know they must then return back into the cave so that they can assist those still imprisoned by their ignorance of the good. This is the key moment in the parable, is that having escaped from the cave, okay, and seen, the sun outside, it's your duty to go back into the cave to tell your fellow prisoners about their real condition, to educate people who are trapped in the cave, who are victims of their own ignorance, to tell them that there's more for them to know. Since the capacity for knowledge is innate in every human being, it's the duty of educators to free their fellow humans from the fetters of opinion by realizing their cognitive potential. So Socrates says, this is quote number 10, "We must reject the conception of education professed by those who say that they can put into the mind knowledge that was not there before, rather as if they could put sight into blind eyes. Our argument indicates that the capacity for knowledge is innate in each man's mind, and that the organ by which he learns is like an eye which cannot be turned from darkness to light unless the whole body is turned. In the same way, the mind as a whole must be turned away from the world of change until its eye can bear to look straight at reality and at the brightest of all realities, which is what we call the good." So, the goal of the law is not to make any one class of individuals happy at the expense of others, but to spread happiness throughout the citizenry by bringing citizens into harmony with each other. So it's a responsibility of the lawgivers to use their knowledge of the good to govern society in such a way as to bring about the optimum degree of goodness compatible with each citizen's abilities. And this would be the realization of justice. Justice requires that the most enlightened use their cognitive privileges for the benefits of the least enlightened. And this is the final quote, okay? So, Socrates says, "So, then our job as lawgivers is to compel the best minds to attain what we have called the highest form of knowledge, and to ascend to the vision of the good as we have described. And when they have achieved this, and see well enough, prevent them behaving as they are now allowed to." What do you mean by that? Remaining in the upper world, i.e. the world outside the cave, and refusing to return again to the prisoners in the cave below, and share their labors and rewards, whether trivial or serious. Okay, that's it. That's the end of the lecture, okay? Thank you.